Hey guys, and welcome back to another Sunday school video. This is week 2 in our Faith Foundation study. Last week we talked about kind of the basics about who God is. We talked a lot about the Trinity. This week we're talking about God's purposes for people, right? So we've talked about who God is, right? Now we want to know, what does God intend for us? Right? Why were we created? What kind of things does God want us to do? Now, this is in a very basic sense, right? We can go into a lot of, minute detail about, the specifics of God's plans for our lives. But we're going to talk about the very basic things. Now, this is something that we kind of talked about already a couple weeks ago in our 16 verses series, right? We talked about that in weeks really, 1 through 3. We talked about, who God is, and we talked about the creation story. Now, that was over 16 weeks ago, really, at this point. So it's been a little while. So for some of you, this may be more of a refresher about these things. But for some of you, maybe you missed that week. That was before we were doing in-person Wednesday night stuff. So you may not have been here for that. And realistically, some of you may have just forgotten. So we're gonna kind of hit some of those same points. So if this sounds familiar to you, that's why. But nonetheless, I think it's always good to kind of refresh ourselves on what are the basics of what we believe, just so that we know for sure that we are all on the same page. So the main idea for today's lesson is that God created the universe and all that it contains for the purpose of glorifying himself. People who are made in the image of God are the highest beings of creation, and we glorify God by reflecting him to the world and loving him with everything that we are. And so, from the very beginning of creation, God made us to live in relationship with him. And we can still experience that fellowship with him through Jesus. I think in thinking about God's kind of purposes for our lives, we see that God has given us some very specific responsibilities, right? And some of you may cringe at the idea of responsibility, right? That you're teenagers, right? And you've been told like, oh, now's the time that you're responsibility free and you should enjoy it. But, many of you probably have realized that you're not. You still have some very specific responsibilities that you're supposed to keep up with. In a very basic sense, you're responsible for getting your homework done on time. You're responsible for finishing your studies and graduating high school, right? Some of you have weekly responsibilities around the house. Your parents have things that they expect you to do on a week-to-week basis. And, I think some very practical examples in my life, right? If you've been to Jess and I's house, you may have noticed that we have a lot of houseplants. Jess and I like having houseplants. I like growing new things. And another thing that you've probably heard us talk about more than once is our dog. Right? We love having a dog. Our dog's name is Bowie. He has 2 different colored eyes. So, he's named after David Bowie, which I think is neat. But we love having a dog. It's so nice. He's very friendly. So he loves, to just sit up on the couch with us and lay in between our legs as we're, just kind of lounging. And he loves to cuddle up. He loves to be pet. He likes to lick people, which, may be a problem depending on who you are and how comfortable you are with that. But it just brings so much joy to our lives, to have him in our home. And so, but those things, having houseplants or having a pet, right? Those things come with an inherent amount of responsibility, right? And so I don't necessarily feel, bad about having that responsibility. That responsibility actually brings a lot of joy to my life. As we grow older, responsibility is handed to us in greater measure. We just naturally gain more responsibility. For example, my first job, when I was 16 years old, I was rolling pretzels. I worked at Auntie Anne's, and the responsibility there was pretty low. The only thing I was responsible for was making sure that there were pretzels in the warmer and that, I ran the cash register. And that was about it. Now, my job now, I have a lot more responsibility as a pastor. I personally get a lot more joy out of being a pastor than I did out of rolling pretzels. Now, there may be times where I'm like, man, I kind of miss those days where I really wasn't responsible for much. But would I go back there if I had a time machine? No. I'm much more happy. I get a lot more joy out of doing this than I did from doing that. But I have more responsibility. I have more things that I'm responsible for, but that's a good thing, right? That brings more joy to my life. And so, from the very beginning, God made us to handle responsibilities that He's entrusted to us, right? And we see that God has given us the tools that we need to do those things well. And so now it's up to us to understand specifically what God expects of us and to live those things out. So we're going to see, the very basics of what we were created for as we look at Genesis this morning. We're in Genesis chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 1 through 5 first. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. There was an evening, and there was a morning, one day." And so when we communicate with an audience, right, as I'm communicating with you right now, there are three things that we ought to keep in mind. What is our audience familiar with? What do we need to tell them? And how do we bridge the gap between those two things? And so with those things in mind, we ought to think about the original audience who would have read Genesis chapter 1. Tradition tells us that Moses probably wrote the book of Genesis, which means that the people who first read it were most likely still wandering in the desert after being freed from their slavery in Egypt. These Israelites had never known a place to call home apart from slavery or camping in the desert. The things that they knew about God had been passed down as parents taught their children, who taught their children, and so on and so forth. Right? That up until this point, all they had was oral tradition. The Israelites were surrounded by groups of people settled in established civilizations. People like the Egyptians or the Canaanites and the Hittites. If these groups were perceived as more civilized, then the Israelites might have been tempted to think that their views about their gods were more advanced or better informed. They may have thought that the Egyptians were right, that the world was birthed out of a cosmic egg, as the Egyptian tradition dictated. Or maybe the Mesopotamian belief was the correct one, and all that we know was created out of the carcass of one of their deceased gods, right? That, they likely had heard multiple creation stories. Genesis 1 reveals a wholly different account, right? That in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's almost as if the writer was saying, as inspired by the Holy Spirit, listen, I know you're hearing all kinds of confusing things from all kinds of people. Let me tell you who's really in charge, what He did, and how you can know Him. The biblical worldview, right, is unique, not only in that we know who created everything, but that we can also have a personal relationship with the creator of the universe. God created people to live in relationship with Him, and through Jesus, He invites us into this same personal relationship today. Jesus in a special position is in a special position to do that for us, because not only is He one with the Father, He was actually present at creation. We see that the Word, that is Jesus, was with God in the beginning in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. We also see in Colossians chapter 1, verses 16 through 17, that not a single thing that has been created was created apart from Jesus. So if we look up at the sky on a clear night, we see countless numbers of stars, most of which would make our sun look tiny. If we look closely at the ground beneath our feet, we find an entire microscopic ecosystem which works together to allow plants to grow. And we see when we look at Scripture that God did all of this simply by His Word. And the Creator of all of this has invited us into a relationship with Him, to know Him deeply and to remain in and with Him forever. So 2 questions to think about as we move on. One, how do these verses lay a foundation for understanding the rest of God's Word? And 2, what difference does it make that the Creator, not the creation, is at the center of this creation story? So next, let's look at Genesis chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 26 through 27. It says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth.' So God created man in His own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them, male and female." So perhaps you're familiar with the idea of religious icons. They are small figures that people look at to remind them of something that's important. For example, some Christians look at the image of the cross, and that image causes them to contemplate Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. Unfortunately, some people tend to worship an icon rather than the thing that icon represents. Many of us use icons every day and we don't even realize it, right? That icons are tied to the apps on our smartphones. You tap on a picture on the home screen and an application launches. The word for that picture is an icon, right? That picture is an image that points you somewhere else, right? Whether that's Facebook, Instagram, whatever it is that you're doing. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 27, we find the word image, which is used multiple times in the Old Testament. Most of the time, it's used negatively. For example, in Numbers chapter 33, verse 52, it says, "You must drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you, destroy all their stone images and cast images, and demolish all their high places." However, here in Genesis chapter 1, God was not talking about stone images, icons, or even, apps or phones. He was talking about people. And He said something amazing about how He made us. So to be made in the image of God means that we were made with a special purpose, which is different from the rest of creation. Think about what makes humanity different from your dog. Or the tree in the park near your house. Our ability to think and reason makes us different. The ways that we understand right and wrong make us different. But the most unique thing about us is that we were created to reflect God's image and God's nature. God made everything, but only humanity was created with the unique responsibility of being His representatives on earth, right? Within that creation. So as His image bearers, we as humans were created to rule over the animals and over the earth. The word rule means to subjugate, to have dominion, or to reign. Humans made in God's image are capable of thinking, discerning, and making choices as God's ruling representatives, right? We have been made capable of governing the earth in His place. And so in caring for God's creation, including its creatures, we should seek to use, not to abuse or misuse what God has provided us. And so when the world looks at us, they shouldn't see people simply living for themselves or living irresponsibly in that position of rulership. Instead, we should be known for carrying out the highest calling imaginable, and that is displaying the image of God who made us. It is our responsibility to strive every day to bring God glory. So 2 questions to think about before we move on. 1, how would you describe the responsibility that humanity was given at creation? And 2, what are the implications of our being created in God's image? And so finally, we're going to look at Genesis chapter 1, but now we're going to look at verses 28 through 31. It says, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. God also said, look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth, and every tree whose fruit contains seed. This will be food for you, for all the wildlife of the earth, for every bird of the sky, and for every creature that crawls on the earth, everything having the breath of life in it. I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good indeed. Evening came, and then morning, the 6th day. So as beings created in God's image, God didn't just place us in an elevated position to sit and bask in that position. He gave us the responsibility of overseeing creation and living in ways that honor him. And we see here in Genesis chapter 1, right, that God gave us 3 very specific tasks. 1, that is to be fruitful and to fill the earth. 2, to subdue the earth. And 3, to enjoy the goodness of everything that God created. So we see that God called the first people to fill the earth and then to tend to it. But these commands went far deeper than just populating the earth. That really it's all about spreading God's image throughout the whole world. It's important for us to understand that these commands did not go away after sin entered the world. We still exercise responsibility over the earth. But after sin, it requires hard work for us to do that. That work can be exhausting, but it can also be very rewarding. God blesses us as we take charge of what he's given us. And when we do it in a way that honors him, right, then that is honoring to God, right? You know, a good example of this in thinking about, creation and our stewardship of it as rulers, right, is that, that authority that God has given us over the earth has given us things like farming, right? Things that have allowed us to feed ourselves, to feed other people, right? We see when we look at history, right, that farming really gave rise to cities and to civilization and to advances, to progress. And so that's a really wonderful, beautiful thing, right, that we would not be able to do had God not given us the authority to do it. Right, but we also see that now that sin has entered the world, that we have the propensity to rule over the world poorly, to rule irresponsibly, right? And so, we see that with things like pollution, things that damage the environment that God has given us to rule over, right? That if we don't exercise our authority well, we can actually damage creation. And so we ought to be careful of our stewardship over it. We see that God not only gives us direction on what to do, he also provides what we need to sustain life. Verses 29 through 30 point to some ways that God has blessed us by listing the plants, the seeds, and the fruits that he has provided us for food. God is the generous provider, and he ensures that both people and animals have all we need to survive. Saw, as used in verse 31, specifically carries the idea of looking with the intention of making a judgment. As soon as his creation was complete, God appraised it like a furniture maker looking over a table that he just completed. God had only one judgment, right? That when he saw it, he saw that it was very good. And as we live as Christians in the world that God has made, we have the unique opportunity to live out the kind of life that God created us to live. You know, think of how blessed we are that we get to know our Creator in a personal way, that we get to care for his creation, and we get to reflect God's image and character to the world. Understanding this leads us to seeing things differently, right? It changes the way that we see the people around us, as they were also created to be image bearers, right? It changes the way that we see the world, knowing that we are responsible to care for it. And it changes the way that we see ourselves, considering that we are all made in the image of our Creator and called to reflect him in the ways that we live. And so 3 questions for you as we close. 1, how would you describe our responsibility for taking care of the world that God created? 2, summarize our mission and purpose as stewards of God's creation. And 3, how does the creation story reflect God's love for us? So I hope that this was beneficial for you. I hope that you've learned some things, or that this was a good refresher for you, right? That this idea of thinking about God's purpose for our lives, we can get really detailed with it, but on a very basic level, right? God has designed us to be his image bearers within creation, right? And so we ought to be living our lives in ways that reflect God's nature and God's character to the world around us, especially to those who don't know him. So I hope that you'll join me next week as we continue on in our Faith Foundation series.